You know, a house is supposed to be the one place where you feel safe, but for some people, that's the last place they ever wanted to be. Tonight, I've got 8 different stories, real situations that happened inside people's homes. Some are creepy, some are disturbing, and some will just make you think twice before turning off the lights. Let's get into it.
The house had been in their family for 3 generations, passed down from grandparents who had built it in the 1940s. It was a modest 2-story colonial. The couple had inherited it 5 years earlier, along with all its quirks and the maintenance needs that come with an aging home. They had always noticed the house felt colder than it should during winter months. The heating bills were astronomical, and despite running the furnace constantly, certain rooms never seemed to warm up properly. The upstairs bedrooms were particularly bad, requiring space heaters just to make them comfortable enough for sleep. Their friends who visited often commented on how drafty the place felt, even when all the windows and doors were tightly sealed. After enduring another brutal winter with heating costs that nearly doubled their monthly budget, they decided something had to be done. The house clearly needed better insulation, and they had saved enough money to finally tackle the project properly. They had gotten quotes from several contractors, but the prices were steep, and they figured they could handle at least part of the work themselves to save some money. The plan was straightforward enough. They would start with the exterior walls in the living room and work their way through the house room by room. The husband had some experience with basic home renovation, and they had watched enough online tutorials to feel confident about the process. They rented the necessary equipment, bought the insulation materials, and set aside several weekends to complete the work. The first wall they opened was behind the couch in the living room. The drywall came down easily enough, revealing the old wooden frame structure underneath. But instead of finding empty cavities ready for new insulation, they discovered the spaces were already filled with something. At first glance, it looked like old rags or newspapers that previous owners might have stuffed in there as makeshift insulation, a common practice in older homes before modern materials became available. But as they pulled out the first handful of material, they realized it wasn't fabric or paper at all. It was fur. Matted, dirty fur that came away in clumps, releasing a musty odor that made them both step back from the wall. They assumed it might be old animal bedding that had somehow gotten into the walls, perhaps from mice or squirrels that had nested there over the years. As they continued removing the material, the smell got worse. Much worse. And then they found the first complete dead animal body. It was a cat, long dead and mummified by decades of dry air circulation within the wall cavity. Its body was contorted into an unnatural position, as if it had been forced into the narrow space. The fur was mostly gone, leaving behind leathery skin stretched over visible bones. They stopped working immediately, both feeling sick from the smell and the discovery. But they had already opened a section of wall that couldn't just be left exposed. They forced themselves to continue, thinking it was probably just one animal that had somehow gotten trapped and died there years ago. These things happened in old houses. But the next section revealed another cat, and then another, each one in a similar state of preservation, each one positioned in a way that suggested they hadn't simply crawled in there and died naturally. The bodies were wrapped in what appeared to be old towels and pieces of cloth, as if someone had deliberately placed them there. By the time they had cleared out just that one wall section, they had removed 7 cat carcasses, 7 animals that had been intentionally stuffed into the walls of their home. The smell had become unbearable, forcing them to open every window in the house and set up fans to circulate the air. They had to take frequent breaks to go outside and breathe fresh air, their stomachs churning from both the odor and the implications of what they were finding. They called the local animal control office, unsure of what else to do. The officer who came out took one look at their discovery and suggested they might want to contact the police as well. There was something deliberate about the way the animals had been placed, something that went beyond simple disposal of dead pets. The officer had seen cases of animal hoarding before, but this was different. This was methodical. Against their better judgment, they decided to check one more wall before calling in professionals to handle the rest. The wall they chose was in the dining room, on the opposite side of the house from their first discovery. They told themselves that maybe the problem was isolated to just that one area, that perhaps a previous owner had lost several cats around the same time and had made the misguided decision to bury them in the walls rather than the yard. The dining room wall revealed even more. Not just cats this time, but small dogs as well. Rabbits. Even what appeared to be a few birds, their delicate bones barely holding together after so many years. Each animal wrapped in similar cloth materials, each one placed with the same careful positioning. Some of the larger dogs had been dismembered to fit into the narrow wall cavities, their remains distributed across multiple sections. The count kept climbing as they continued their grim excavation. 23 animals in total from just those 2 walls. The house suddenly felt different to them, contaminated by whatever had happened there decades earlier. They couldn't shake the feeling that someone had been using their home as an animal burial ground. They never finished the insulation project. Professional remediation crews came in to remove the remaining animal remains from throughout the house, finding dozens more in walls they hadn't even opened yet. The total count reached over 60 animals, spanning what appeared to be several decades based on the varying states of decomposition and the different types of cloth used to wrap them. The family had developed their daily routines around their daughter's needs and limitations, creating a structured environment that provided her with independence while ensuring her safety and comfort. She had been born with a genetic condition that left her completely blind and with mobility challenges that required her to use a wheelchair for longer distances, though she could navigate familiar spaces on foot with the aid of tactile markers and memorized layouts. At 20 years old, she had adapted remarkably well to her disabilities and had developed skills that allowed her to live with considerable independence within the familiar environment of the family home. She could prepare simple meals, manage her personal care, and navigate the house confidently using techniques she had learned through years of occupational therapy and adaptive training programs. The house had been modified extensively to accommodate her needs, with tactile indicators throughout that helped her navigate safely between rooms, braille labels on appliances and frequently used items, and a layout that remained consistent so she could move around without assistance from family members. Her bedroom was on the first floor to eliminate the need to navigate stairs, and the bathroom adjacent to her room had been equipped with grab bars and other safety features. Her parents both worked full-time jobs to support the family and pay for the medical expenses and specialized equipment that weren't covered by insurance programs. Her father typically left for work around 7 in the morning, while her mother's schedule was more flexible and allowed her to work from home several days each week. But on Tuesdays and Thursdays, both parents were away from the house during daytime hours, leaving their daughter alone for periods of 4 to 6 hours. The family had discussed these arrangements extensively and had concluded that their daughter was mature and capable enough to handle being alone during the day, especially since she rarely left the house when her parents weren't home, and neighbors were aware of her situation and would respond if she needed assistance. They had installed additional security measures, including deadbolt locks and a security system that would alert police if doors or windows were opened unexpectedly. Tuesday afternoons started like any other day when she was home alone. Her mother had left for work around 9 in the morning after helping her daughter prepare lunch and ensuring she had everything she needed for the day. The plan was for her to work on correspondence courses she was taking through a community college program, then prepare a simple dinner that would be ready when her parents returned home around 5 o'clock. The security system was armed in the daytime mode that would alert the monitoring company if exterior doors or windows were opened, but allowed normal movement throughout the interior of the house without triggering alarms. This system had worked well for months, providing peace of mind for the parents while allowing their daughter the freedom to move around her home normally during daytime hours when they were at work. She was working on a writing assignment in her bedroom around 2 o'clock when she heard sounds that indicated someone was moving around in other parts of the house. At first, she assumed one of her parents had come home early from work, which happened occasionally when meetings were canceled or when someone needed to retrieve forgotten items from the house. But when she called out to announce her presence and ask who was there, the response wasn't from either of her parents. Instead, she heard unfamiliar male voices and footsteps that suggested at least two people were moving through the house systematically, opening doors and drawers as if they were searching for specific items they expected to find. The realization that strangers had somehow entered her home while she was alone and vulnerable was terrifying in ways that someone with normal sight and mobility could never fully understand. She couldn't simply look out a window to see how many intruders there were or what kind of vehicle they might have arrived in. She couldn't run quickly to a neighbor's house or hide in locations that might not be obvious to people searching the house systematically. Her options for contacting emergency services were limited to a phone in her bedroom and a medical alert device she wore around her neck that could summon paramedics, but wasn't designed for reporting crimes in progress. She managed to dial 911 on her bedroom phone and whisper her address and situation to the dispatcher, but she had to hang up quickly when she heard footsteps approaching her room. The two intruders found her in the bedroom within minutes of entering that part of the house. They seemed surprised to discover someone was home, and initially appeared unsure of how to handle the situation since they had apparently expected the house to be empty during daytime hours when most people would be at work or school. The men spent approximately 30 minutes searching through the house while keeping her confined to the bedroom, looking for cash, prescription medications, electronics, and other items that could be quickly converted to cash through resale or pawn shops. They seemed to know exactly what they were looking for, and where such items were typically stored in residential homes. Throughout the ordeal, they made comments about how easy it would be to eliminate witnesses who couldn't identify them or provide useful descriptions to police investigators. The fact that she was disabled seemed to make them more confident that they could complete their robbery without serious legal consequences, since she couldn't chase them or provide the kind of detailed suspect descriptions that might lead to their identification and arrest. The break-in ended when police arrived in response to the 911 call she had managed to make from her bedroom phone. The intruders heard the sirens approaching and fled through the back door they had used to enter the house, leaving behind some of the items they had collected, but taking cash and small electronics that could be easily carried and quickly sold. She was physically unharmed, but emotionally traumatized by the experience of being trapped and helpless, while strangers ransacked her home and discussed whether to hurt her to prevent her from reporting the crime. The violation of her safe space and the realization of how vulnerable she was when alone in the house created lasting anxiety that affected her ability to function independently in the way she had before the break-in. The investigation revealed that the intruders had disabled the security system by cutting phone lines that connected it to the monitoring company, a simple technique that rendered the expensive security equipment useless for its intended purpose of summoning help during emergencies. The building had started life in the early 1990s as a single-family row house in a working-class neighborhood of Philadelphia. Like many similar structures in the area, it was narrow and tall, designed to house one family comfortably with a small backyard and basic amenities. For decades, it served that purpose well, sheltering generations of families who worked in the nearby factories and shops. By the 1980s, the neighborhood had changed significantly. Many of the original families had moved to the suburbs, and the area was struggling with economic decline. The row house had been abandoned for several years when a local nonprofit organization focused on affordable housing acquired it. Their mission was to convert old buildings into multifamily housing for low-income families, particularly those with children who needed stable, affordable homes. The conversion process took nearly 2 years. The organization worked with local contractors to divide the original single-family space into multiple apartments while staying within city building codes. They installed new electrical systems, updated the plumbing, and created separate entrances for each unit. The goal was to provide safe, decent housing for families who might otherwise struggle to find affordable options in the city. The building was designed to house 3 separate families. The first floor was converted into a 2-bedroom apartment. The second floor became another 2-bedroom unit, and the third floor was divided into a smaller 1-bedroom space. Each unit had its own kitchen and bathroom, and families were responsible for their own utilities. The nonprofit carefully screened tenants, prioritizing families with children who demonstrated financial stability and a commitment to maintaining the property. The first families moved in during the spring of 2021. The building quickly became home to 12 people, multiple adults and 9 children ranging in age from toddlers to teenagers. Despite the challenges of urban living and tight quarters, the families generally got along well. Children played together in the small shared backyard, and parents looked out for each other's kids when needed. The residents had noticed some minor electrical issues over the months leading up to the incident. Occasionally, outlets would stop working, and once or twice, circuit breakers had tripped for no apparent reason. They reported these problems to the nonprofit, which sent maintenance workers to address what seemed like typical issues in an older building with updated electrical systems. On a cold February night in 2022, most of the residents were settling in for the evening. Children were finishing homework or getting ready for bed, while adults were winding down from long workdays. The building was warm and filled with the typical sounds of busy families, television programs, conversations, and the general bustle of daily life. The fire started sometime after 10 p.m., likely in the electrical system somewhere within the walls of the building. Old buildings with new electrical installations can be unpredictable, especially when the original structure wasn't designed to handle modern electrical loads. The flames spread rapidly through the wall cavities and between floors, moving faster than anyone could have anticipated. By the time smoke detectors began sounding throughout the building, the fire had already compromised several escape routes. The narrow stairways that had been adequate for a single family became death traps for multiple families trying to evacuate simultaneously. Despite the efforts of responding firefighters and the desperate attempts of neighbors to help, 12 people lost their lives that night. 9 children and 3 adults who had simply been trying to live safely in what they thought was their secure home. He was a devoted father of 3 who worked 2 jobs to support his family. His day job was at a local manufacturing plant, and evenings he did freelance mechanical work for neighbors and friends. Despite working long hours, he always made time for his children's activities and was known in the community as someone who would help anyone who needed it. His wife often joked that he was too trusting for his own good, always seeing the best in people even when others might be more cautious. The family had been going through some financial difficulties. Medical bills from his wife's recent surgery had strained their budget, and they were looking for ways to generate some extra income. He remembered the diamond ring his mother had given him before she passed away. It was beautiful, but not something he or his wife would ever wear, and it had been sitting in their jewelry box for several years. After having it appraised, he learned it was worth considerably more than he had expected. The appraiser suggested he might get a better price selling it privately rather than to a jewelry store, so he decided to list it on Craigslist. He took several clear photos, wrote an honest description, and posted it with a fair asking price based on the appraisal. The response was immediate and overwhelming. He received dozens of emails and phone calls from people interested in purchasing the ring. Most seemed like legitimate buyers, asking reasonable questions about the ring's history, its condition, and whether he had documentation of its value. He scheduled several appointments for potential buyers to come to his house and examine the ring in person. His wife was somewhat uncomfortable with having strangers come to their home, but they had done it before when selling other items online, and it had always gone smoothly. Their house was in a safe suburban neighborhood, and they figured having the meeting during the day when neighbors were around would minimize any risks. They planned to have any serious buyers meet them in the living room, away from where the children typically played. The first few appointments went exactly as expected. Potential buyers came, examined the ring, asked questions, and either decided it wasn't what they were looking for or said they needed time to think about it. Everyone was polite and professional, and the meetings reinforced their confidence that selling the ring privately was a good decision. The group that contacted him on a Wednesday seemed different from the others. They asked fewer questions about the ring itself and more about his schedule and when would be convenient to meet. They said they were very interested and wanted to see it as soon as possible. Something about their communication felt slightly off, but he couldn't pinpoint exactly what was bothering him. They arranged to meet on Friday evening. His wife suggested postponing until the weekend when she could be there too, but they had been very insistent about Friday, saying they were only in town for a short time. He agreed to meet with them alone, thinking it would be fine since all the previous meetings had gone smoothly. When they arrived, there were 3 of them instead of the 2 he had expected. They seemed more interested in looking around his house than examining the ring, asking questions about his family, and making comments about the neighborhood. Their behavior made him increasingly uncomfortable, but he tried to focus on the transaction and get them to leave as quickly as possible. The situation escalated rapidly when he told them the price was firm and not negotiable. One of them became aggressive, demanding he lower the price significantly or face consequences. When he refused and asked them to leave, they made it clear they had no intention of going anywhere peacefully. The confrontation turned violent, and despite his efforts to protect his family and property, he was fatally shot in his own living room while his wife and children were trapped upstairs, listening to everything unfold below them. He had been searching for affordable rental housing for over 2 months, competing with dozens of other applicants for every decent property that came on the market in his price range. The rental market had become incredibly competitive, with landlords able to demand first month's rent, last month's rent, and security deposits that totaled thousands of dollars up front before anyone could even move into a property. His current living situation was temporary and unsustainable, staying with friends who had been generous enough to let him sleep on their couch while he searched for his own place. But everyone understood that the arrangement couldn't continue indefinitely. He needed to find his own apartment soon, but every place he applied for seemed to go to someone else who could offer more money or had better credit references. The house he found listed on the online marketplace seemed almost too good to be true. It was a 3-bedroom house in a decent neighborhood, listed for rent at about 30% below market value for similar properties in the same area. The listing included several photos that showed a clean, well-maintained interior with modern appliances and updated fixtures that would normally command premium rental prices. The listing description explained that the owner was relocating for work and needed to rent the property quickly, which was why the price was so competitive compared to other available rentals. The supposed landlord requested that interested renters contact him through the messaging system on the marketplace platform to arrange viewing appointments, claiming that he was still out of town but would be available to show the property on specific days. He sent a message expressing interest in the rental and providing some basic information about his employment and rental history, as requested in the listing. The response came quickly, with the supposed landlord agreeing to meet him at the property on Saturday afternoon to show him the house and discuss the rental terms. The landlord provided an address and asked him to meet at the front door at exactly 2 o'clock. He arrived at the address a few minutes early and waited in his car until exactly 2 o'clock, then walked to the front door as instructed. The house looked well maintained from the outside, with a neat yard and fresh paint that supported the landlord's claims about the property's condition. The man who answered the door appeared to be in his 40s, dressed casually but professionally, and seemed friendly and knowledgeable about the property. He introduced himself as the owner and explained that he was indeed relocating for work, which was why he needed to rent the house quickly rather than selling it in the current market conditions. The tour of the house started normally, with the landlord showing him through the main floor rooms and explaining the layout and features of the property. Everything looked exactly as it had appeared in the online listing photos, clean and well-maintained with appliances and fixtures that were in good working condition. The rental price still seemed too good to be true, but the landlord's explanations about his work situation and timeline for renting made the deal seem legitimate. As they moved through the house, the landlord asked increasingly personal questions about his employment, living situation, and financial resources. At first, these seemed like normal screening questions that any landlord might ask to evaluate a potential tenant's ability to pay rent and maintain the property. But the questions became more invasive, focusing on whether anyone knew where he was that day and whether he had told friends or family about the rental appointment. When they reached the back of the house, the landlord suddenly stepped behind him and locked the back door they had just entered, pocketing the key before pulling out a handgun that he had been concealing under his jacket. The friendly demeanor disappeared completely as he made it clear that this had never been about renting a house, but about isolating and robbing someone who had cash and valuables that could be taken without much risk of immediate detection. The situation became a hostage scenario as the armed man demanded money, credit cards, and personal information that could be used for identity theft and financial fraud. He forced his victim to empty his pockets and provide passwords for banking accounts and credit cards, threatening violence if he didn't cooperate fully with the demands for financial information. The house itself wasn't actually owned or controlled by the supposed landlord, who had been using fake rental listings to lure victims to vacant properties where he could rob them without interference from neighbors or passers-by. He had apparently been running similar scams for months, targeting people who were desperate for housing and therefore willing to meet strangers in unfamiliar locations without taking proper safety precautions. The robbery continued for over an hour as the gunman systematically went through his victim's belongings and forced him to provide access to online accounts and financial information. The isolated location of the house meant that even if someone screamed for help, neighbors were unlikely to hear or respond quickly enough to provide assistance. The gunman had chosen his hunting ground carefully, selecting properties that were temporarily vacant but still maintained well enough that they wouldn't attract attention from police or neighborhood watch groups. The victim's escape came when the gunman made the mistake of leaving him alone briefly while going to another room to search for something. A back door that hadn't been properly secured provided the opportunity he needed to flee the house and run to safety, though the gunman pursued him briefly before apparently deciding that the risk of capture was too great to continue the chase. He made it to a nearby business where employees called police and provided a safe place for him to wait until officers arrived. The house was searched thoroughly, but the gunman had fled immediately after the escape, leaving behind only the fake rental listing and evidence of the scam that had been used to lure victims to the location. Police discovered that similar fake listings had been used to target other victims over a period of several months, though most of the previous crimes had gone unreported because victims were too frightened or embarrassed to come forward. The college rental market was brutal for students trying to find affordable housing within walking distance of campus. Tuition increases had outpaced student aid programs for years, forcing more students to work multiple part-time jobs while carrying full course loads, leaving little money available for housing costs that seemed to increase every semester. Sharing apartments and houses with multiple roommates had become the only way most students could afford to live independently. He had found the room through a housing board posting from someone who claimed to be a graduate student looking for a responsible undergraduate to share a 2-bedroom house about 6 blocks from the main campus. The rent was significantly responsible options he had explored, and the location was perfect for someone who relied on walking and bicycle transportation to get to classes and his part-time job. The initial meeting with his potential roommate had gone reasonably well, though the graduate student seemed somewhat antisocial and withdrawn compared to the outgoing undergraduates who typically populated the college housing market. But many graduate students were focused primarily on their research and thesis work, so a quiet roommate who wouldn't interfere with study time actually seemed like an advantage rather than a problem. The house itself was old and somewhat rundown, typical of the rental properties that surrounded college campuses and were maintained at minimal standards because landlords knew students had limited options and would tolerate conditions that permanent residents would never accept. But it was clean and functional, with 2 separate bedrooms that provided adequate privacy and a shared kitchen and living area that were sufficient for basic needs. His roommate had already been living in the house for several months before he moved in, and had established routines and territorial boundaries that became apparent during the first few weeks of living together. The graduate student kept strange hours, often staying up all night working on what he claimed were research projects, then sleeping during daytime hours when most people were at work or school. The nighttime activities were disruptive, but not initially alarming, involving typing, phone conversations, and movement around the house that made it difficult to sleep through the night. When asked about the noise, the roommate explained that his research required communication with subjects and colleagues in different time zones, making nighttime hours more productive for certain types of academic work. But the behavior became increasingly strange over the weeks and months that followed. The roommate began asking intrusive questions about class schedules, work hours, and social activities that would indicate when the house would be empty or when his roommate would be sleeping. He showed unusual interest in personal belongings, particularly electronics, and anything that might contain personal information or financial data. The graduate student also began bringing people to the house at odd hours, claiming they were research collaborators or study group members. But the visitors seemed more like street criminals than academic researchers. They would arrive late at night and stay for hours, engaging in conversations that sounded more like planning criminal activities than discussing scholarly work. The meetings always took place when the undergraduate roommate was supposed to be sleeping or away from the house. Food began disappearing from the shared kitchen, along with small personal items that had monetary value or could be easily sold. When confronted about the missing items, the graduate student became defensive and accused his roommate of being paranoid and antisocial. He suggested that the missing items had probably been misplaced rather than stolen, and that living with roommates required a certain level of trust and tolerance for shared use of common items. The situation escalated when the undergraduate began finding evidence that his room had been searched while he was away at classes or work. Personal belongings had been moved slightly from their usual positions, drawers had been opened and closed improperly, and his laptop showed signs of being used while he was away from the house. Confronting the roommate about these violations of privacy led to angry denials and accusations that the undergraduate was imagining problems that didn't exist. The breaking point came on a Thursday night in early October when he went to bed around midnight after finishing homework assignments that were due the following day. He had taken melatonin to help overcome the insomnia that had been plaguing him for weeks, partly due to stress from the increasingly uncomfortable living situation, and partly from the disruption of his roommate's nocturnal activities that made quality sleep difficult to achieve. He woke up sometime around 3 in the morning with the distinct feeling that someone was in his room, despite having locked his bedroom door before going to sleep, as had become his habit since the situation with his roommate had deteriorated. The melatonin made him groggy and disoriented, but he could definitely sense another presence in the dark room that shouldn't have been there. As his eyes adjusted to the darkness, he could make out a figure standing at the foot of his bed, motionless and silent in a way that seemed predatory rather than accidental. The figure was definitely his roommate, but something about his posture and the way he was holding his arms suggested he was carrying something that he didn't want to be seen clearly in the darkness. When he turned on the bedside lamp, the full horror of the situation became clear. His roommate was standing there holding a large kitchen knife, positioned as if he had been watching and waiting for the right moment to act. The expression on his face was calm and calculating, without any sign of surprise or embarrassment at being discovered in such a threatening position. The confrontation that followed was brief and terrifying, with the roommate initially trying to claim he had entered the room for some innocent purpose and that the knife was coincidental. But his explanations made no sense, and his demeanor remained threatening even as he backed toward the bedroom door. He made comments about how easy it would be to make someone disappear without anyone noticing for days, especially in a college town where students often went missing for various reasons. The undergraduate managed to get his roommate out of the bedroom and locked the door behind him, then spent the rest of the night awake and listening for sounds that might indicate another attempted intrusion. He could hear his roommate moving around the house for hours, occasionally trying the door handle to see if the bedroom remained locked, but never actually attempting to break down the door or force his way back inside. The next morning, the roommate acted as if nothing had happened, making casual conversation about weekend plans and upcoming exams as if he hadn't been caught standing over someone's bed with a knife just a few hours earlier. The disconnect between his threatening behavior and his normal daytime demeanor was almost more frightening than the original incident, suggesting a level of mental instability that could lead to unpredictable violence. He moved out of the house that same day, forfeiting his security deposit and breaking his lease agreement rather than spending another night in the same building with someone who had demonstrated such clear violent intentions. He never reported the incident to police or college authorities, partly because he wasn't sure how to explain what had happened and partly because he just wanted to put the entire experience behind him as quickly as possible. They had been planning the patio project for over 2 years, saving money and researching designs that would transform their backyard into the outdoor entertaining space they had always dreamed of having. The house came with a large backyard that had been nothing but overgrown grass and weeds when they bought it, with a few scattered trees that provided decent shade but no real landscaping or usable outdoor space. The previous owners had been an elderly couple who had lived in the house for nearly 40 years before moving to assisted living. They had been gardeners in their younger days, and remnants of old flower beds and vegetable gardens could still be seen in certain areas of the yard, though everything had been overtaken by weeds and volunteer plants that had sprouted up after years of neglect. The couple had big plans for their backyard renovation. They wanted to install a large stone patio that would connect to the back of the house, creating an outdoor room where they could barbecue and entertain friends during warm weather. They had measured and planned every detail, from the placement of outdoor furniture to the lighting that would make the space usable even after dark. The patio design required excavating a rectangular area about 20 feet by 30 feet to a depth of about 8 inches, where they would install a base layer of gravel and sand before laying the stone pavers. It was a lot of manual labor, but they had rented a small excavator for the weekend and felt confident they could handle the digging themselves, especially since the soil in their area was generally soft and easy to work with. Saturday morning arrived with perfect weather for outdoor work. They had marked out the patio area with spray paint and were ready to begin digging. The excavator made quick work of removing the surface layer of grass and topsoil, revealing the darker earth underneath that looked rich and fertile, probably enriched by decades of leaves and organic matter that had decomposed in the yard over time. The digging was going smoothly until the excavator bucket hit something solid about 6 inches down in one corner of the marked area. At first, they assumed it was a large rock or maybe an old tree root that would need to be removed before they could continue. But when they climbed down into the shallow excavation to investigate, they found something that didn't look natural. It was white and smooth, partially exposed where the excavator had scraped away the soil. The shape was curved and about the size of a dinner plate, clearly not a rock or piece of wood. They used hand tools to carefully expose more of the object, brushing away dirt and debris until they could see what they had uncovered. It was a human skull, yellowed with age but still largely intact. The empty eye sockets stared up at them from the dark earth, and several teeth were still embedded in the jawbone. They both stepped back from the excavation immediately, their hearts racing as they tried to process what they were looking at. Their first instinct was to call the police, but they hesitated, wondering if there might be some innocent explanation for what they had found. Old cemeteries sometimes existed in areas that later became residential neighborhoods, and perhaps their property had once been part of a burial ground that had been forgotten over the decades. Or maybe it was an old pet burial that had been disturbed by their digging. But as they looked more closely at the skull, it was clearly human and appeared to be adult-sized. There was no way this was a pet burial or some kind of historical artifact that could be explained away easily. Someone was buried in their backyard, and they had no idea how long the remains had been there or how they had gotten there. They covered the skull with a tarp and called the police, unsure of what else to do. Within an hour, their backyard was filled with investigators, crime scene technicians, and a coroner who began the careful process of excavating the rest of the burial site. What had started as a weekend home improvement project had turned into a criminal investigation that would consume their lives for months. The careful excavation revealed not just one set of remains, but parts of what appeared to be at least 3 different people buried in the same general area of the yard. The bones were scattered and incomplete, suggesting the burials had taken place at different times or that the remains had been disturbed and reburied at some point. Some bones showed signs of trauma that could indicate violent death, though the condition of the remains made definitive determinations difficult. The investigation expanded beyond their property as police searched public records and interviewed long-time neighborhood residents to try to identify the remains and determine when the burials might have taken place. The case eventually went cold when investigators were unable to identify the victims or connect the burials to any specific crimes or missing persons cases from the relevant time period. The remains were removed from the backyard and turned over to the county for proper burial. But the investigation file remained open, classified as a homicide case pending further evidence or information that might someday provide answers. The couple never built their patio. The section of yard where the remains had been found was restored and reseeded with grass, but they could never look at that area the same way again. The family had been planning their vacation for months, coordinating schedules and booking accommodations for a week-long trip to visit relatives in another state. It was their first real vacation in over 3 years, as work demands and financial constraints had made extended travel impossible until recently. They were all looking forward to the break from routine and the chance to spend uninterrupted time together away from the usual distractions of daily life. Their house was a modest 3-bedroom ranch in a quiet residential neighborhood where crime rates were low and neighbors generally looked out for each other's properties when people traveled. They had lived there for 8 years and had never experienced any problems with break-ins or vandalism, even when they had gone away for long weekends or short trips in the past. Before leaving for vacation, they took all the usual precautions to secure their home. They arranged for a neighbor to collect mail and packages, set up automatic timers for interior and exterior lights to create the appearance that someone was home, and asked another neighbor to occasionally check on the property and move their trash cans on collection day to maintain the illusion of occupancy. The vacation went perfectly, with beautiful weather and quality time spent with extended family members they hadn't seen in years. The children enjoyed playing with their cousins, and the adults appreciated the opportunity to relax and catch up on sleep without the pressures of work schedules and household responsibilities. They took hundreds of photos and made memories that would last for years to come. As their vacation week came to an end, they began the familiar process of packing up their belongings and preparing for the drive home. They were already talking about their next vacation and discussing how refreshed they felt after spending time away from their normal routine. The drive home was pleasant, with the children sleeping in the back seat and the parents enjoying conversation and music as they covered the familiar miles back to their neighborhood. They arrived home on Sunday evening just as the sun was setting, pulling into their driveway with the satisfaction of a successful vacation and the anticipation of sleeping in their own beds after a week of hotel rooms and guest bedrooms. The house looked exactly as they had left it, with the automatic lights glowing warmly in the front windows and the lawn maintaining the neat appearance they had established before leaving. But when they approached the front door with their luggage, they immediately noticed something was wrong. The deadbolt was unlocked, even though they distinctly remembered securing it before leaving for vacation. The door itself was slightly ajar, as if someone had recently entered or exited without pulling it completely closed behind them. They hesitated on the front porch, unsure whether to enter the house or call police immediately. It was possible they had simply forgotten to lock the deadbolt in their rush to leave for vacation, and maybe the door had blown open due to wind or settling of the house foundation. But their instincts told them something wasn't right, and they decided to investigate cautiously rather than walking blindly into what might be a dangerous situation. The father unlocked the front door completely and pushed it open, calling out to announce their return home in case there was an innocent explanation for the unlocked door. Instead of silence, they heard voices coming from deeper inside the house, followed by footsteps and the sound of furniture being moved around. Someone was definitely inside their home, and whoever it was wasn't trying to hide their presence. They retreated to their car and called police, explaining that they had returned from vacation to find strangers occupying their house. While waiting for officers to arrive, they watched through their front windows as shadows moved around inside, suggesting that multiple people were living in their home and had made themselves comfortable during the week they had been away. The police response revealed a situation that was more complex than a simple break-in. The house was occupied by a group of 6 adults who claimed they had legal rights to live there based on squatters' laws and tenant protections that varied from state to state. They had apparently researched the relevant statutes and believed they could establish residency rights by occupying the property for a certain period of time without being challenged by the owners. The squatters had not simply broken in and made themselves at home randomly. They had systematically researched properties in the neighborhood to identify houses that appeared to be vacant or temporarily unoccupied, looking for opportunities to move in and establish what they claimed were legal tenancy rights. They had been watching the house for several weeks before the family left for vacation, noting the patterns of activity that would indicate when it would be safe to move in without immediate detection. During the week the family was away, the squatters had moved in completely, bringing furniture and personal belongings that they arranged throughout the house as if they were legitimate residents. They had changed the locks on some doors and had begun receiving mail at the address, creating documentation that they could use to support their claims of legal residency if challenged by authorities or property owners. The legal situation was more complicated than anyone had anticipated. While the squatters had clearly entered the property illegally, the laws governing tenant rights and eviction procedures meant that removing them would require formal legal proceedings that could take weeks or months to complete. Simply calling police to remove trespassers wasn't sufficient when the occupants claimed tenant status and had documentation suggesting they intended to establish permanent residency. The squatters became increasingly aggressive when it became clear that the property owners were not going to simply abandon their home and allow the occupation to continue. They made threats about damaging the property if forced to leave, and they claimed knowledge of legal loopholes that would allow them to remain in the house indefinitely while eviction proceedings worked through the court system. The family was forced to stay in a hotel while their attorney worked through the legal process of formally evicting the squatters from their own home. The process took 6 weeks and cost thousands of dollars in legal fees, during which time the squatters continued living in the house and utilities that the homeowners were still responsible for paying. When the squatters were finally removed by court order, they left behind thousands of dollars in damage to the property and had stolen numerous personal belongings that could never be recovered. The house required extensive cleaning and repairs before it was habitable again, and the family never felt completely safe there, knowing that the same thing could happen again anytime they traveled.